Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hey, everybody. I hope you're having a blessed week and that everything is really going super well for you. Today, we're going to talk about a period of history referred to as the Gilded Age. The term the Gilded Age was actually coined by Samuel Clemens, more popularly known as Mark Twain. He co-authored a book called The Gilded Age, and according to my notes, by this he meant that the period of history that we're talking about, roughly the post-Civil War period up to about 1900. So we're talking about 1870 up to about 1900, roughly speaking. The term Gilded Age, by this, Mark Twain meant that the period was glittering on the surface, but it was corrupt underneath. During the period known as the Gilded Age, there is a lot going on. There are a number of very wealthy individuals becoming even more wealthy. Some of these names are still very much a part of our culture and society today. We think of Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, although to a lesser extent. But perhaps the name that is still very much in American society today that's still active is J.P. Morgan. If you bank with Chase Bank, you will still see J.P. Morgan's name on your stubs and other forms of paperwork. These men, sometimes referred to as captains of industry, for those who view these men in a positive light. For those who view them in a negative light, they're referred to as robber barons. These folks amassed increasing amount of wealth because they came to dominate their particular industries. And during the post-Civil War period, the United States enters into what historians call a second industrial revolution. And some folks are becoming very, very wealthy. According to Eric Foner from the book Give Me Liberty, he writes the following. He says, between the end of the Civil War and the early 20th century, the United States underwent one of the most rapid and profound economic revolutions any country has ever experienced. There were numerous causes for this explosive economic growth. The country enjoyed abundant natural resources. Okay, for example, right around the turn of the century, California is going to discover oil. Now, there had been oil in California for forever, but oil becomes a major industry for California, and this is a natural resource, of course. It also states that there's a growing supply of labor. We talked about the rise of immigration. And because the Industrial Revolution is going on, and because some of these corporations like Carnegie Steel and Rockefeller Oil, because some of these companies are growing, and because the railroads themselves are booming, there is a great need for cheap labor, and many immigrants are coming to fill that need. It goes on to state that there was an expanding market for manufactured goods and the availability of capital for investment, right? And so for these reasons and others, the economy in the United States is really going to take off. It's going to boom, excuse me. And lots of folks, let me caveat that, a handful of folks are really going to become wealthy. So when Mark Twain refers to this period as the Gilded Age, really what he is saying is that if you were to take a look at the surface of the United States, if you didn't scratch too deep, right, if you only saw what was on the surface, then what you would have seen of the United States during this period of history would have looked to you as though the United States was expanding its economy, its market is growing, and it appears on the surface that anybody can become wealthy. But the underlying aspect of the term gilded means that you have basically taken a base item that has no worth to it, and you sort of overlay it with a thin veneer of gold so that it looks like it has value. But underneath that thin layer of gold is something that's really worthless. So, I mean, basically, when Mark Twain's talking about the Gilded Age, it's almost as if he's saying the United States is kind of like a giant turd, and we've put gold on top of it so that when someone holds it in their hand, what they see is a golden nugget. But if you just dig underneath the gold, what you're going to find is a turd. And what he's really trying to refer to here is corporate greed. He's trying to talk about the fact that there are a number of individuals within the United States who are living in abstract poverty. Jacob Riis refers to these individuals as the other half. They are folks who work for the Vanderbilts. They're the folks who work for the Rockefellers. They're the folks who work for the Stanfords and Crockers, but they themselves do not yet have this mass of wealth, although there's always the idea that you could amass that wealth, right? I mean, we take a look at someone like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Neither one of them were born into wealth. They sort of pulled themselves up by the bootstraps. And so one of the big questions that begins to develop during the Gilded Age is the question, how does one become wealthy? What does it take? And one of the mainstream ideas of the day that was forwarded as a way to explain this was a pseudo-scientific theory known as social Darwinism. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer, among others, took Charles Darwin's idea of evolution and they applied it to society. And basically what they argued is that the reason why some people are wealthy, the reason why Rockefeller is wealthy, is simply because he has an innate thing. He has what it takes to become wealthy. Other people simply don't have it. Social Darwinists would argue that you should not, and by you I mean the government or charities, should not help out the poor because all you're really doing is stringing along people who will never make it, who can't make it because they don't have the special, strong characteristic which allows for other people who do have it to be successful. Social Darwinists, it might come across as very cruel and cold, and very calculating, but it is a theory that took very prominent hold. There was, on the other side of that, a idea known as algorithm. Algorithm is this idea that, you know, with enough luck and determination, you too can become the next Rockefeller. It really is at the bedrock of the American dream, right? It's that idea that if I go to this class that Professor Keyes is teaching, and if I pass that class, and if I amass a degree, then I'm going to make it. Then I'm going to get hired, and then I'm going to get promoted if I just simply put in more work. It's that idea. And with a little bit of luck, you can make it too, right? And this is an idea, of course, that pops up at the time. And some people hold on to it. A lot of immigrants really held on to that idea of algorithm. But I want to read to you from a book, just real quickly. It's called The Gilded Age. And they write this. Since 1873, when Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner published their satirical novel, The Gilded Age, Americans have used the term to designate a distinctive period, the last quarter of the 19th century. The Gilded Age proved to be a resilient designation because it seemed to fit so well. Twain and Warner's novel scathingly satirized post-Civil War America as a land of craven materialism as well as hopelessly corrupt political practices. Indeed, the makers and shakers of the Gilded Age were not the President of the United States. It wasn't your congresspersons. Oftentimes, those folks were corrupt and they were being bribed and they were being bought off by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who had somewhat shady practices, right? I mean, honestly, these men were very ingenious about the way they went about running their companies. For example, they incorporated vertical and horizontal integration. For instance, John D. Rockefeller didn't want to pay another company to make oil canisters for himself, for example, or barrels to hold his oil in. So instead of paying another company that, he's simply going to make his own barrels. He's going to, in the end, have an opportunity to reap 100% of the profit. Okay, and that is going to help him become successful. But these individuals also engaged in unfair practices. They bought out businesses that were in competition with them, effectively creating monopolies. In fact, the Southern Pacific Railroad in California, which was governed by the Big Four. The Big Four were very central in building the Transcontinental Railroad. They included people like Leland Stanford and Crocker and others. But they basically would go into shippers' books, and they would look at their accounting books, and what they would charge people is the most amount that the market would bear. And that means that, you know, I might offer this person over here one price and this person over here a different price because they can pay more over here than these guys can. But I'm going to push you just enough to the point where I'm not going to like isolate you and make you not want to work with me. So there's definitely these practices which are, some might argue, unethical. That's why oftentimes these folks are called robber barons, right? It goes, but robber barons and political bosses are only part of the story of the Gilded Age. And as far as I'm concerned, I think they're actually the less interesting part of the Gilded Age. It says, as Mark Twain and Warner suggested, it was indeed an era of extremes, a time of rapid industrialization coupled with cycles of crushing unemployment, of both unprecedented wealth and dire poverty, right? Dire poverty. And when we talk about Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, what Jacob Riis is really talking about in this book is to say, here's a group of people who are on the flip side of this wealth-making reality, right? The majority of people are living in tenements. They're living in areas where there's no natural air allowed in, where there's no light allowed in, where they're crammed together and diseases are running rampant, right? It's a difficult time, right? But it's an interesting time nonetheless, because in some ways what happens during the Gilded Age is it really sets up an environment for the period of history that's going to follow it. And that is a period of history known as the Progressive Era. And progressives, and we'll talk about them more later, but they attempted to try and deal with some of the social and economic and political problems that was created by the Gilded Age. I mean, in many ways, the Gilded Age politicians of the day engaged in what we would call laissez-faire practices. Laissez-faire meaning hands-off. This is why during this latter part of U.S. history, there's a lot of forgotten presidents because they didn't do a whole lot, right? And a lot of them were corrupt. So we're really looking at makers and shakers of business as being makers and shakers of public policy. The progressives are going to try and deal with some of these problems, such as child labor and the use and abuse of children by these corporate bosses to be able to extract labor from kids who can be manipulated, paid less, forced to work long hours. I mean, oftentimes when we talk about child labor, you're really talking about the most helpless people in American society, okay? You have to understand that during this time, during the Gilded Age, and even thereafter, the idea of what makes a person poor is very, very different than the way that we might look at poverty today. I mean, today we might understand that there are structural issues in place which might prohibit you from being able to get a job, right? The idea that you might not make a living wage, the idea that you may not be able to find work constantly. The view of poverty during the Gilded Age was that if you're poor, it's not because you couldn't find work, it's because you didn't work. If you don't have any money, it's not because you weren't paid enough, it's because you didn't save enough. You weren't thrifty enough. And so there's really this lack of understanding about the structural components that result in poverty. And then, of course, poverty breeds other social problems, the prostitution, criminality, drug use, alcohol abuse, right? And so the view of folks during the Gilded Age was that there was something innately, inherently problematic with them that resulted in them becoming poor, which then might lead to them being drunk and what have you, rather than understanding that the poverty itself may have caused that drunkenness. It may have caused their criminality, but that poverty isn't necessarily the result of some innate problem with them. It's that they can't make enough money, right? It's not like today where you're guaranteed a certain minimum wage. That doesn't exist. The idea during the Gilded Age is that, hey, if I'm a boss, I'm going to hire person A for X amount of money. But if I can find person B who will take the same job for less, I'm going to pay them that, right? I'm going to get that person to come on. So it's an interesting time period. But dig into your textbook, look at the videos, see what you think of this time period, and think to yourself, is the term the Gilded Age a fitting term for this time period? There's arguments on both sides as to how to run on that. So let me know what you think. And of course, if you have questions or anything else throughout the week, let me know and I'll get back to you. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper. And may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, everybody.